Hello, everyone. Welcome to Chapter 4, Prenatal Development and Birth. So here's our chapter preview, and let's jump straight into it. Conception. Conception occurs when the genetic material of the sperm and egg unite to form a single cell zygote. 1 in 4 couples experience difficulties conceiving. Artificial insemination uh, is one method by which to kind of get around that. It involves injecting sperm from a partner or donor into the uterus. In vitro fertilization, several eggs are removed from a woman's ovary and manually combined with sperm in the lab, returned to uterus in hopes that the eggs will implant. So kind of just straightforward, very definitional. A lot of these slides will actually be heavy on definitions in the beginning. So prenatal stages, we're going to look at three: germinal, embryonic, and fetal. And embryologists study early growth and development. So the germinal period begins during the first trimester, lasts about 2 weeks. The zygote divides many times through mitosis, forming the blastocyst, not a blastoise, that's a Pokemon. Hollow ball of about 150 cells that is the size of the head of a pen, between 8% and 30% of pregnancies and miscarriage. So kind of the idea here is that the organism, at a species-wide kind of like natural selection kind of way, the organism understands that it will not survive outside the womb, so therefore it aborts to limit genetic uh, mutations or some kind of issue, something that can mess up the species is kind of like the theory here. Okay, next, the embryonic period. It's the third and eighth week after conception. The placenta is tissue fed by vessels. The embryo receives oxygen and nutrients from the mother. Placenta barrier offers partial protection against potential dangerous hormones and chemicals. So the idea with the placenta barrier is that, so for example, the mothers release cortisol, which is a stress hormone, in response to some environmental stressor. That stress hormone can be harmful to fetal development if it's excessive amounts. So what the placental barrier tries to do is block the cortisol from reaching the fetus. However, the placental barrier only offers partial protection in that case, and in some cases, next to no protection. Neurodevelopment, organogenesis. The blastocyst differentiates slash specialize into specific tissues and organ systems, central nervous system, kidneys, lungs. Brain begins forming 3 to 4 weeks. Permanent parts of the brain develop first. So organogenesis, kind of straightforward. It's the genesis of the central nervous system. It begins this process of specialization. It differentiates. So it goes from individual cells to, okay, now these are, I'm just making up something. These are the motor cortex cells. These are the prefrontal cortex cells, etc. So we're seeing increased specialization. And the parts of the brain that regulate the most basic parts of what you need to be alive, aka breathing, digestion, waste, develop first. Embryonic developmental issues, one out of 2,000 pregnancies, neural tube fails to fully close. You have spina bifida, which is part of the spinal cord, is not fully encased in the protected covering of the spinal column. You have anencephaly, which is a failure to close at the top of the neurotube. Fatal brain areas above the brainstem do not develop. So kind of just different areas of the neurotube not closing, creating dangerous, at times fatal or lifetime developmental conditions as a result. So the fetal period is kind of just described as occurring between the first and the third trimester. And there's three processes of brain development associated with the fetal period, and we're going to go into more detail of all three. So let's begin with proliferation. Number of neurons increases by hundreds of thousands every minute. Concentrated period of proliferation occurring between 6 and 17 weeks. Infants have around 100 billion neurons. Proliferations of glial cells. So the idea here is that as development occurs, you see a rapid increase in neurons. They're proliferating. They're increasing again by a rapid pace. But there are specific periods in which certain neural systems are developing at a rapid pace. So generally referred to as sensitive periods. That is, again, periods where the development is accelerated in certain parts of their brain or certain parts of development is accelerated. Now let's look at migration. Neurons move from the center of the brain to specific locations where they become part of a larger neural units influenced by genetic instructions. Some neurons migrate passively, others actively. Once it's in its destination, the neurons begin communicating. So literally, you're migrating, you're moving from the center to specific locations. And it's influenced by the genetic instructions. And basically, some kind of are just swept away; they're passively taken there, and others they're en route. They got a roadmap, and they're trying to get to their destination. But regardless of how they get there, once they get there, you start to see the development of these very complex neurological networks that will be with that child or the human, that fetus for the rest of their lives. Now let's look at differentiation. Two major theories of neuron specialization. Neurons specialize based on where they land, or cells know what they are supposed to be and where they're intended to go on their path before reaching their destination. So we have two competing theories here. One is that once a neuron arrives, they don't know where they're going, but once they get there, they get kind of told what to do. So you have undifferentiated neurons arriving in a location. You see all these your other neuron friends, they're all doing stuff, and then they learn what to do based on where they are, aka they become specialized based on their location. Versus cells know where they're going, they have a roadmap, they're getting there, they have a destination, and they have a goal in mind. Myelin coat neurons in myelin sheaths, which makes neuron electrical signals travel fast. So a big point that I want to make clear here: it's not just the proliferation in the activity of brain cells, aka neurons. It's the efficiency. You see rapid advancements in development across the lifespan, from fetus all the way to old age, associated with myelination. It's the efficiency, it's the speed by which neurons communicate with each other. And that speed is owed to myelination. Fetal programming. Environmental events / maternal conditions during pregnancy alters the prenatal development of the embryo fetus and set certain physiological functions. Prenatal experience and change a person's physiology. So the idea here is that there is a programming process during the fetus period, and specifically the fetal programming hypothesis, which argues that the environment in utero can alter the development of the fetus with a permanent effect on the phenotype, affects early life and long-term health, and all kinds of other outcomes. So this is kind of what I really focused on in my PhD program, and that was how and in what environmental factors influence fetal programming. So with the idea being that certain, again, environmental factors literally impact and permanently alter and set the physiology and the neurological development of a fetus, which affects them for the rest of their lives. And that's what the fetal programming hypothesis argues, is that it's known as the origins of disease hypothesis. So literally the origin of disease from complex environmental dynamics which occur prenatally. So let's make this a little more specific. Let's look at teratogens, any disease, drug, or other environmental agent that can harm a developing fetus. There are sensitive periods, organ systems that are most at risk during development. So I alluded to that earlier. And you can see this is a classic chart to the right-hand side. But the point here is that, and you don't need to memorize the weeks or whatever, but just look at this. Certain areas, certain parts of development are rapidly developing at certain periods of prenatal development. So the eye, legs, whatever, week 4, you see a rapid advancement in that physical development. Dosage and duration: greater and longer exposure, the more likely serious damage will occur. So if a mother is super stressed out and she's, whatever, all of a sudden a civil war breaks out during the 4th week in pregnancy, and it's very severe and it's very chronic, a developing fetus in this example, just based on this chart, be at higher risk of having vision impairments throughout their life. Just one example, kind of broad strokes. And the idea is that it's not just being exposed to a stressor, it's the amount, the duration. The longer it is, the more, and the higher the dose, the more severe or the more potentially severe and harmful that stressor will be to a developing fetus. Now, genetic makeup, susceptibility to harm influenced by genetic makeup. So some mothers and thus, or I should say, in parents, may be more susceptible to certain harmful effects by the environment because of their own life, their own history of development that is kind of passed down genetically, biologically to their fetus. So that increased vulnerability makes them more sensitive to environmental, harmful environmental effects. So again, stress may be more harmful to them because of a genetic susceptibility to whatever uh, drug use or something along those lines. Environment effects depend on the quality of prenatal and postnatal environments. So straightforward, the environment uh, shapes the development of a fetus and postnatally in early childhood and infants as well. 15% of newborns have minor problems, 3% have severe abnormalities due to teratogens. So let's look at some common teratogens. One is tobacco. Rates of smoking decline across pregnancy. Low income, young, less educated, indigenous, white women most are at risk. Effects of smoking during pregnancy vary, but they're associated with respiratory problems, lower birth weight. Postnatally, children are at higher risk of SIDS. So kind of we see this across development. The exposure to harmful environmental effects are generally associated with lower income individuals and people who kind of lack social capital within a society. So that could be racial and or gender based or disabled individuals, etc. But the effects, I should say, of the the impact of smoking depend on kind of when smoking occurs and again how long it occurs. So that duration and dosage effect. The harmful effects of smoking increase the longer you're smoking during pregnancy. Again, back to that duration and dosage effects. Another potential teratogen is alcohol because it easily passes through the placenta barrier. The placenta barrier, as I stated, only offers partial protection, and for alcohol, not much. It easily passes through that barrier. It can lead to neuronal death and impairment of glial cells, and fetal alcohol syndrome, facial abnormalities, and CNS damage, which seizures, tremors. That's generally what it's associated with. Difficult to untangle the effects of alcohol consumption during pregnancy. So, however, and you'll see this for all factors, all these kind of studies, is that when an individual is smoking or drinking during their pregnancy, they're probably doing so because they're stressed out about other stressful things going on in their life. They're low. We already saw it. They're lower employed. They have uh, they're poorer, they're a single mother, etc. They have a toxic home environment. So these stressors are combining to uh, to increase the probability of smoking and drinking during pregnancy. So the question then becomes, okay, what is it? Is it the alcohol or is it all these other environmental influences that are causing these harmful effects of fetal development? Or is it some combination of the two? And it's very difficult to untangle because, and da 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 da, drug use doesn't occur in a vacuum. It's this collection of stressors going on. It is very difficult to untangle what specifically is causing a negative impact because there's so many negative things going on in that person's life. So one way to quantify this is adverse child events. 11 questions that assess 8 areas of abuse and household dysfunction before 18. And I've personally done a ton of research with ACEs, they're typically referred to. And you can find a million studies on ACEs. If you Google ACEs plus whatever you're interested in, depression, high school outcomes, eating disorders, etc. There's a million studies on this. And the point of ACEs is that no one individual stressor is more harmful than the collection, the totality, the chronic nature of the stressor. It goes back to that duration and dosage effect of stressors, aka teratogens. And not only that, but they argue, or at least some scholars within who study ACEs argue, that it is literally impossible to disentangle the effects of these different stressors. You can statistically control for it, but it's so intercorrelated that it's actually not only not possible or possibly not possible, is useless because that's not how the real world operates. So we should look at the collection of the stressors, the entirety of the stressors. And how do they do that? By asking them a set of, in this case, 11 questions. And they ask you, or a parent, were you physically abused? Were you verbally abused, sexually abused? And then they add up each one of those 11 questions, and then they give you a cumulative score, and then they look for associations of that cumulative score with certain developmental outcomes. And measures of household dysfunction include living with someone with a mental health problem, living with someone who abused substances, incarcerated family, witnessing domestic violence. And we understand this, intuitively, that these household dynamics, these family dynamics, influence development. And I just grabbed a study on the left-hand side, just kind of some results. So after controlling for race, ethnicity, age, unemployment status, smoking status, pre-pregnancy alcohol use, the researchers found that increasing ACEs were positively associated with higher odds of alcohol use during pregnancy, and pre-pregnancy drinking was strongly associated with alcohol use during pregnancy. So let's think back to chapter 1 here. So we have a positive association, a positive correlation between ACEs. So the more ACEs go up, that is events that happen to a mother prior to becoming pregnant. So this lifelong adverse child events, increasing the odds of alcohol use during pregnancy. And there's a lot of examples from ACE studies like this. Now I want to look at cocaine, and I always find this very interesting because it's case in point of kind of the argument, and my argument, that how we understand human behavior, how we understand psychology is mirrors society and impacts society. So let's look at an example here. Cocaine use during pregnancy. It's unclear whether offspring development outcomes are because of cocaine use or prenatal or postnatal environment, less attentive to children. So the idea here again is that someone who's taking cocaine during pregnancy, they probably have other issues going on in their lives, right? So there's all these other factors going on. And we know from research that if you are using cocaine during postnatal period, you're more likely to have interactions with your child and you're less attentive to your child. So is it that the child is negatively impacted by cocaine use during prenatally? Or is it because postnatally the parent is ignoring, or I should say, being less attentive to the child? Or is it some combination of the two? And that's tough to disentangle. And this brings us to the crack baby hysteria. September 1985, the New England Journal of Medicine published research that described his findings that babies born to cocaine using mothers. And this brings us to the crack baby hysteria. In September 1985, the New England Journal of Medicine published research to describe the findings that babies born to cocaine using mothers remain smaller, sicker, moodier, and less social than other infants. And you should recall from chapter 1 some issues with the next bullet point, and that is there was no control group, and it was a small sample with an N, that is the total number of participants was only 23. And the researcher failed to consider perinatal environmental factors such as poor nutrition, housing conditions, and the dearth of quality prenatal care. So once again, cocaine using mothers are probably not having the best prenatal care, and they're probably going to have poor nutrition, all these other factors. But this researcher did not control for that, so that's a big problem. Now, granted, the researcher did say that he did not control for these things, and that this should be taken with a grain of salt. But it was picked up by the media, it's picked up in the 1980s, and you get a slew of articles Just one example in the Washington Post, children of cocaine. The inner city crack epidemic is now giving birth to a newest horror, a biological underclass, a generation of physically damaged babies whose biological inferiority is stamped at birth. So literally, what are the repercussions here for this understanding of human development? What is the framing here? And I think this is a great example, and that's why I try and emphasize this in this course. You're literally saying, and again, spoiler, they're going to emphasize black children are a biological underclass, a subhuman uh, subspecies of human that is dangerous to other children. And we're about to get into that with some other headlines. It provided medical support for putative legislation and dehumanization of children. So look at some of these headlines. A time bomb in cocaine babies. Disaster in the making. Crack babies start to grow up. Drug babies invade schools. So now we've established that children exposed to crack during pregnancy are subhuman. But what happens when those subhuman children go to school with non-subhuman children? They're going to be a threat by that definition, correct? So again, the our understanding of psychology, understanding development, and you're literally creating legislation to punitively punish mothers who are addicts or abusing substances during pregnancy. In 1997, a group called CRACK, Children Requiring a Caring Community, papered inner city billboards with offers of $200 in cash for cocaine addicted men and women. 60% of its first 150 recipients were Black or Hispanic. So again, this is going to be racially targeted. To such an extent, this hysteria was cooking up that individuals were going around poor neighborhoods with disproportionately made up of minorities and offering them money to undergo sterilization. Although exposure to cocaine in uterus can damage a fetus, a baby cannot be born addicted to cocaine. No difference between prenatal exposure to cocaine and to crack cocaine. There's a long historical issue in the United States that trying to differentiate the the punishment handed out for offenses dealing with cocaine versus punishments dealing with crack cocaine. And crack is, stereotypically defined to Black Americans. So therefore, um, in line with with this line of thinking, um, you must target and punitively charge individuals and mothers in this example who are using crack with more severe consequences for using crack. Some studies have found no differences on IQ tests between children who were exposed to cocaine in utero and non-exposed children. It's kind of straightforward. And if you're interested in any other studies kind of like this, then check out this book pictured here. Now let's look at some environmental hazards. Now this just happened. This is very interesting. So radiation is one example. So higher than normal rates of intellectual disabilities and cancers. Well, look at this headline from Science. France grossly underestimated radioactive fallout from an atomic bomb test, study finds. Documents suggest a single test in 1974 exposed the entire population of Tahiti to fallout about 88,000 people. Only 63 Polynesian civilians have been compensated, estimated that more than 100,000 people may have been contaminated in total cancer. So these are environmental influences, and kind of going back to that Broff and Brenner model that we saw in chapter 2, the impact of those larger macro systems, in this case, weapon testing, nuclear bomb testing, literally, impacting development, disproportionately causing cancers in this population of Polynesian civilians. So here's another study I want to point out about pollutants. Longitudinal study in Japan, N equals 33,000. Again, N equals number of participants, where the participants were recruited in 2001 and followed. So going back to chapter, don't remember if it's 1 or 2, probably 1 and 2, longitudinal study. So we look at 33,000 people and we find those people. And in this case, what they did is they looked at where those 300 or 33,000 people lived, calculated the amount of pollution exposed to them based on city reporting, And then they followed up with those parents at when their children were 2.5 and 5.5 years old, and they administered the child kind of behavioral assessments. And they found that prenatal exposure to traffic-related air pollution was associated with behavioral problem milestone delays in children. So the more pollution, the more impulsive, and the lower their inhibition. So we have a positive correlation and a negative correlation. So again, these postnatal uh, pollution, these environmental factors impacting development. And it would be historically based, right? Because these form of pollution, these specific pollutants would not exist prior to the Industrial Revolution. So again, historical periods matter. Young mothers are at risk for pregnancy complications, and there's two arguments for why that may occur. The first is the reproductive system may not be physically mature, so a mother is not biologically capable of giving birth at that moment of their life. Another is the ACEs argument. So a teenage mom, are teenage moms typically more stressed or less stressed out, or have more things going on in their life that are negative and more harmful than a non-teen mom? And for anyone who's watched Teen Mom 2, I mean, that Janelle sequence, that speaks to this issue. So the idea here is the more becoming a teen mom is associated with higher ACEs. So the more stressed out you are, or the more adverse child events you experience, the higher the odds of becoming a teenage mom. And like I said before, disentangling what is actually occurring, it can be difficult. So I want to look at stress during pregnancy, and that's the HPA axis, the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal gland. And this is one way that stress, that intergenerational trauma is passed on from parents to their children, their offspring. And basically what happens is during pregnancy, and this is kind of broad strokes, uh, mothers will release, as I stated before, a stress hormone called cortisol, and that stress hormone cortisol, if released in large quantities, if that dosage and that duration is high, it could cross the placental barrier and program fetal physiological systems. So literally, your postnatal reactivity to stress, your baseline stress level, being programmed through this biological mechanism that is the HPA axis. So two studies I wanted to highlight. The first is a study of women exposed to Hurricane Katrina. Pregnant women were interviewed during pregnancy about their experiences during the hurricane. High hurricane exposure was defined as having 3 or more of the 8 severe hurricane experiences. So again, going back to that cumulative effect of stress, that being more important than one specific stressor, such as feeling that one's life was in danger, walking through flood waters, or having a loved one die. The frequency of low birth weight and preterm birth was higher in women with higher hurricane exposure than women without high hurricane exposure. So being exposed to a hurricane during pregnancy was associated with higher odds for a child being born with low birth weight, which is associated with a number of long-term developmental issues. One way that low birth weight is programmed in the child is through the HPA axis. So that is one example of a natural experiment. And they're called natural experiments because no one created Hurricane Katrina in the hurricane machine. They naturally occur, and we can then test the impact of huge macro, again, going back to that Bronfenbrenner model, impact of trauma, of stress, of these big shifts in culture on mothers and how it impacts their offspring, so the intergenerational transmission of stress. And next, I want to look at the M23 occupation of the Goma DRC. Rwanda proxy groups occupied a city of the Democratic Republic of the Congo for 13 days. Just kind of highlighting my study, please. And what I found was that mothers, mothers, I should say, pregnant during the occupation gave birth to shorter children. So this is kind of a point here that I'm trying to make, is that even in conditions of heightened violence, of poverty, even in those conditions, when a new stressor comes on top of it and it's extreme, and there's duration to it, it can still negatively impact a population. So, right now it's topical. Hurricane Haiti, for example, even though these Haitians are already struggling for a whole host of reasons, historical reasons, this new stressor in the environment can still negatively impact offspring development. Malnutrition, disruption of formation of spinal cord, smaller neurons, smaller brain, smaller child, associated with short-term and long-term development delays. I just grabbed this figure off an article, but kind of an idea of how these systems interact. Buffered with parenting practices and school resources. Now I'm going to go into what buffering means shortly, but buffered is the idea that there's a protection. It's buffering the impact. It's lessening. It's dampening the impact of malnutrition. So these environmental protective factors, these family protective factors, lessening the degree to which malnutrition in this case, but other stressors are harmful to a developing child. Now, this is interesting. Now, historically, we have focused on the maternal impact of stress on offspring development, and for good reason. We've found that it matters. But also, new research has found that paternal stress and paternal biological factors impact offspring development. So, for example, older paternal age is associated with higher odds of miscarriage, elevated risk of neural tube problems, kidney problems, and is a risk factor for schizophrenia in their offspring. Paternal stress is hypothesized to be intergenerationally passed on to offspring through DNA in the sperm. Sperm carries epigenetic information. Female non-stressed rats injected with sperm from stressed rats produce stressed offspring. So the idea here is that imagine a non-stressed out mother, and then imagine or I should say a female rat, a very stressed out a non-stressed out female rat, and a very stressed out male rat. If you take this sperm from a very stressed male rat and inject it into a non-stressed female rat, that offspring will show signs of stress reactivity similar to the father. So again, highlighting that impact of paternal stress. And the figure on the left is not as important. I just kind of grabbed that from an article, but it's kind of just a visual illustration. You don't know the exact differences or anything like that here. But it's just the idea that stress has epigenetic changes. Stress from the father can have epigenetic changes on their offspring. So again, epigenetics, that idea that you switch on or off certain genetic expressions, so it makes them more susceptible to environmental stressors postnatally because the father was stressed out. The perinatal environment. Childbirth is a three-stage process. We have contractions, delivery the placenta, and children are increasingly born at home. So again, back to the idea that historical period matters, where childbirth, where families decide to deliver their children changes based on the culture and historical period. Possible hazard, brain cells die if starved of oxygen, an oxygen shortage, where an umbilical cord pinches or entangles around the infant, which occurs when there's a breach, and the risks are cerebral palsy and cognitive impairments. So if there's complications in the pregnancy, such as the umbilical cord being tangled up in the child, it can lead to long-term cognitive impairments and physical disabilities such as cerebral palsy. Other possible hazards, cesarean section, surgical procedure in which an incision is made in the mother's abdominal and uterus, has not reduced the risk of fetal neonatal death in the US on a population scale. 11% are unnecessary the first time and 65% are unnecessary the second time. However, planned C-sections are rated positive by women who will undergo the procedure. And here you can see a chart of the rates of cesarean sections across countries. Mothers' experiences, culture, class, historical futures, different views of the desirability of having children, birth practices. Some tribes in Namibia labor by themselves as a show of strength. Other groups in rural North India have a more hands-on experience. So just there's cross-cultural variation is the point in how uh, cultures decide to deliver their children. Class is correlated with infant mortality, and as well as race, with Black infants are at twice as high as risk for neonatal deaths than white infants. And postpartum depression, 50% of new mothers, previous depression and lack of social support, increased risk, prolonged depression associated with hyperactive offspring. Back to ACEs again. ACEs predict postpartum depression. The idea is if you're depressed before pregnancy, you have a higher risk of being depressed after pregnancy. And prolonged depression is harmful for the child, not just prenatally for biochemical reasons, but also postnatally because the person's depressed. So they are less likely to interact uh, positively and have these dynamic interactions with their offspring, which can lead to elevated cortisol levels, so that higher stress reactivity or really under stress reactivity, which is also problematic, and hyperactive offspring behavior. And on the left is just a figure of birth weights, or not birth weight, birth rates by year, and you can see millennials having less children. So again, historical period, our historic era impacting childbirth decisions. Moving on to father's experience, some fathers experience symptoms of pregnancy. They report fear, being unprepared, helpless, and these feelings typically improve. And physiological markers of stress, such as cortisol, show decreases or returns to equilibrium with time following the delivery of their child. Identifying at-risk newborn babies. Low-born infants. Moving on to identifying at-risk newborns, low birth weight, which is LBW. Infants account for 2/3 of infant deaths, only 9% of births in the US. The more lifetime risk factors, that is chronic stress and cumulative stress, the more at risk a pregnancy. And we have all these listed here: stress, race, substance use, nutrition, class, age, infections. Allostatic load, I want to focus on this. The cumulative wear and tear on the body's systems owing to repeated adaptations to stressors, summing scores on a host of blood pressure, cholesterol, etc. So this is actually kind of similar to ACEs, but it's kind of the biological outcome of ACEs. So what they do is through a similar methodology, they look at this list here, different blood pressures, cholesterols. They have a list of all these conditions, and then they just add them up. They sum it together, and then they research or they analyze statistically the extent to which that composite, that allostatic load, is associated with whatever, low birth weight, for example, in their offspring. And they routinely find that allostatic load is related to poor developmental outcomes within a mother, within a father, and their offspring. Another term for this is weathering, which is famously found that Black women have higher allostatic loads, aka more kind of biological damage from these repeated adaptations to stressors than other groups of races and genders. And finally, protective factors. Outcomes of early risk depend on the quality of the postnatal environment. Low birth weight children exposed to sensitive parenting in toddlerhood exhibited faster rates of improvement in EF, which is executive function, which is kind of just globalized for the purpose of this example, just kind of working memory and vision control. And were virtually indistinguishable from their normal birth weight peers by age 5. Cumulative risk with internalizing problems were buffered by adolescence religiosity, in neighborhood collective efficacy in poor neighborhoods among Black teens. So 2 points here. What this means is just because you get exposed to one risk factor, and you are low birth weight, that doesn't mean that kind of your long-term outcomes are written in stone and you can't change it. There are protective factors that buffer the impact or lessen the impact of low birth weight on long-term developmental outcomes. So in this example, sensitive parenting lessens the impact of low birth weight on a measure of executive function at 5 years of age. And same kind of thing below, cumulative risk, so kind of ACEs, uh, was buffered. The effects of ACEs on internalizing problem was buffered by these neighborhood effects. So it's not just parenting, but these other uh, systems. Those, again, imagining the Bronfenbrenner systems. These other systems and factors that emerge from those systems buffer the impact of stressors of certain biological outcomes such as low birth weight. They dampen the effects of of low birth weight, internalizing problems of whatever, on long-term developmental outcomes. So they protect an individual from harmful effects of low birth weight, internalizing whatever harmful events. Some protective factors are personal sources, government support, and supportive postnatal environments. So again, going back to the Bronfenbrenner model, it's not just personal resources, which are great. Sensitive parenting does impact development for children at risk, but also, as that second bullet point shows, and it's actually a study from a good friend of mine, that neighborhood effects and legislation, countrywide effects, could protect a vulnerable, at-risk child from poor long-term developmental outcomes. Thanks everyone for listening. I'll see you next week. Have a great week.